Hello, everyone. This is Elizabeth Preston.
And I'm Sarah Adams.
And you're listening to
the Writing Docs Podcast,
where we discuss how businesses can help their teams to become better and more confident writers. If your team needs help achieving positive writing outcomes, then contact us at 877-249-7483 or email us at info@hurleywrite.com.
Hey everyone, this is Sarah Adams, and I'm an executive consultant at Hurley Write. You're listening to the Writing Docs Podcast, where we talk about how businesses can help their team members become better and more confident writers. I'm here with my co-host, Elizabeth Preston.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks so much for being here, everybody. We are so excited to have Deborah Bosley on our podcast today as well. Deborah, welcome to the Writing Docs.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
Me too. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. And I just want to give our listeners a little bit of a background on you. You were the founder and principal of the Plain Language Group, and I can't wait to ask you more about that. You're also a professor emerita of technical writing at UNC Charlotte, and you hold a PhD in rhetoric and composition with a specialty in technical communication. Now, for listeners out there, Deborah has spent the last 20 years helping companies and government agencies meet regulatory requirements and create content that is understandable and accessible to audiences. She has given presentations on writing all over the world to business, government, and nonprofit organizations, and she has worked with JP Morgan Chase, Abbott, eBay, and Google, among many others. Deborah is also highly decorated with several awards for her work in writing and technical communication, and has authored numerous articles and 3 books. Deborah, welcome to our podcast. This is incredible. Now, your work really is hammering home the idea of plain language, and hence the name of your business, right? The Plain Language Group. How would you define plain language? What does that look like?
Well, there's an international definition from the International Plain Language Federation. So I'm going to give you that, and then I'm going to give you my little caveat. So the IPLF defines plain language as a communication is in plain language if its wording, structure, and design are so clear that the intended audience or audiences can easily find what they need, understand what they find, and use that information. And when I talk about plain language, I like to add in proven strategies, because we actually have empirical evidence, not only from the research that we've done, but from research like Edelman Trust Index and others that show that the use of plain language achieves the goals that we will end up talking about today.
Well, and you have quite the pedigree working with different companies, helping them achieve this. And you've been doing this a long time. What are some common misconceptions that you've encountered when it comes to plain language? I think sometimes people may misinterpret what exactly that looks like.
Well, I'll set this up with a story. So my husband, who's used to also teach tech writing, he's a big supporter, of course, of what I do. But one day we were sitting around talking, and I said, well, I'm about to do a webinar in plain language. And he said, oh, you mean you're going to talk about dumbing down? And I said, those are grounds for divorce. I'm calling my lawyer right now. So that's the first thing we have to be clear with is that simplifying content is much harder than making things complex. And so we've got to help people get rid of the attitude that I have to use long, complicated sentences. I have to use multisyllabic words because that proves how smart I am. So that we are kind of moving a bit away from that. It used to be, I think, a little more of a response than it is now, but nevertheless. And the hardest audience to really to work that with are scientists, people in the medical profession, tech people. surprisingly, financial people are a little more open to, where there's a direct customer in mind, they're a little more open. But I do talk about this as not dumbing down. So the other issue I get from attorneys all the time is that plain language is less precise than legal language, or that plain language can't be legal and clear at the same time, which I also argue because judges have voided contracts because they said people couldn't possibly have understood it. When you talk about the law, you always use the word interpret. Well, interpret means that there are multiple meanings, or else there would be no, in quote, sort of interpretation. So, and again, we have some attorneys. There's a whole organization for practicing attorneys and law professors who advocate for plain language. And then I think finally, the third misconception I have, and this is probably works a little into the dumbing down problem, is ego. So when somebody is an expert and they have this vast array of knowledge, what they want to do is show off that knowledge. And plain language does not show off the particular quantity of knowledge that one might have using the common words in that. Well, I'll make myself laugh. In my English profession, we would call it our discourse community, but it's really people who use the same kind of jargon. And so jargon can be kind of an ego, look how smart I am. So I think those would be the kinds of misperceptions that, and I would say it's not the misperceptions or misconceptions that customers have. It's misconceptions that the producers of content have.
That's very interesting. And I think you bring up some good points about, should it really be about what the customer needs versus how smart and intellectual we sound?
Well, yeah, and I always, one of the quotes, I quote myself quite frequently, so I'm going to quote myself here. One of the things I often say is, tell people what they need to know, not what you want to tell them. Because again, if I have a lot of knowledge about something, I want that knowledge to go out into the world. But really, most people only have a few questions that content is supposedly going to answer. So tell people what they need to know, not what you want to tell them.
I love that. Especially, you have this idea of speak to your audience with your audience's needs in mind instead of what you want. You're writing
Absolutely.
for someone, not for yourself. And that's hard, especially
That's very
when
hard.
we're used to trying to show off in our writing. But I think it was Einstein that said, intelligence is not how hard you can make it, but how much you can simplify something so someone else can understand that complicated concept. Something along those lines.
Yeah,
I'm not even going to quote Einstein because I don't even know what's happening. No.
I can quote Einstein. He said,
Yes.
if you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it.
That's what it was.
So sometimes complexity hides that I don't really know what I'm talking about, but I'm using all these words to make me sound good.
Lawyers get accused of that a lot, right? They get accused that you're hiding behind language and these complexities instead of just telling me what you actually mean.
Absolutely. And, along with that, and with corporations, of course, the word now for a while has been transparency. Everything has to be transparent. But transparent doesn't equal clarity. Transparency just means I told you. Clarity means I told you in a way that you can understand. So we're under the illusion that if something is transparent, I'm going to understand X, Y, or Z. But in fact, I think technically a lawyer would say transparency is the telling, not the understanding.
So, wow.
Anyway.
Sneaky.
I like that because
it's just
I like that because it really makes you, it forces you to think about your audience, and it forces you to practice empathy, which I was fascinated to read that empathy is a huge thing in your work. Talk to me about how that
Yes.
plays a role.
Well, we do read and react with our emotions. We think that everything is logical, rational, going through particular brain cells that will give us a logical response. But in fact, we read and react with our emotions. So one of the things I do to get this idea of empathy across is if we were in in a webinar or something, in an audience focused right now with people I can't see. But if I asked your audience in the last week, if you've received an email with dense paragraphs, or you've been asked to sign a legal document that you didn't understand, or you took a look at your cell phone bill and you really can't understand why it's $387 this month, how many, raise your hand? Well, every hand in the audience is going to go up because we deal with confusing content every day. And then I say, and how did that situation make you feel? And people say frustrated, angry, confused. People my age tend to say stupid, because we grew up in a generation where if you didn't understand it, there was something wrong with us. Younger kids now, if they don't understand it, there's something wrong with the writer, which in fact is true. And then I ask people, all right, so all of those emotions have been evoked by what you just read. What do you think happens when you deliver your content from your company to your customers? And then I think suddenly they can see what it's like to be in that role of audience, but also to see the emotional problems that complex language causes. And then those emotional responses can mean people don't read it, or they misunderstand it, or they don't, particularly, frankly, another study, they don't like you or your company. So, or they distrust what they've read. So evoking empathy and recognizing the problems that your audience might have, and then doing something about it by using plain language, shows that you really care about the people you're interacting with.
Which is customer relations 101, right?
Yes.
I mean, aside from making you a good person who cares about other people, it's smart from a business sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is, again, research that shows that customers trust the content from companies that they can understand. I mean, it's sort of a duh, of course situation. So, being good to your customers by giving them information that's easy for them to read and understand is a huge branding opportunity. I mean, Vanguard did it a few years ago when they developed what they call plain speak. That was a whole branding model. And I don't think they do that anymore, but others have in the past, have used it to their advantage, as
It
they
also
should.
seems like it also seems like plain language and using that empathy is an important thing to have with internal communications as well, particularly as our teams get more multilingual and multicultural. What are your thoughts on that, Deborah?
Well, I'll go with that two ways. The first way is just to tell you a situation I had myself at when I retired from the university where I was teaching. I received a very long email about my eligibility to continue health insurance. And by the time I got to and I read it, of course, because that's very important information. Then when I got to the bottom of it, it said, if you are not in the state system, this email does not apply to you. And so I oh my God. So I called HR up immediately and said, do me a favor, put that line at the very beginning. And then you won't. So clearly, plain language is really important. And in an academic environment, people tend to be a little less likely to use it because, professors. But nevertheless, it's critical. And then I just finished giving a keynote address at an Office of Language Access in Honolulu, and it's a government agency statewide because there are 137 languages spoken by Hawaiians and Hawaiian citizens. And the issue of multiliteracy, second language, and varying culture is certainly something that's very important there. So they recognize that plain language is almost a necessity for people to understand government information. And by the way, translations are much cheaper. Again, empirical evidence. Translations are cheaper when the content is first written in plain language. So that's just a business case for it. But I think so I'm going to keep going on this for a second, because we all talk about the concept of access. And access is not just relevant to, someone can use their wheelchair and get into a building. Access is the ability we all have or don't have to understand critical information that affects our lives. So I think it's critically important for all of us. But I think, again, if you want to be empathetic, we need empathy for those people who didn't grow up speaking English, or those who did and did not go to college, or, whatever the education, cultural situation they come from. Plain language will help kind of, even the bar, whatever the term for it is, kind of
even the playing field.
Level the playing field. Thank you very much. I'm glad somebody can edit me so I sound like I know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I think your background shows you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's questioning that.
All right. Well, good.
You've talked a lot in interviews about the difference between usability and readability. And that how I think those are two words that people think are interchangeable, but maybe not from a plain language perspective. Talk to us about that.
Okay, so readability, I'm going to talk about this in two different ways. So the first way is that readability means that I know what the words say. So, for instance, I might be working with a set of instructions and it says insert A into B. But maybe in the instructions, they didn't tell me what A or B actually is. So it's readable. I know the words, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I understand the words. For example, readability often, on the other hand, is perceived as a grade level score. And companies love to test their documents to get a grade level score. And I, in fact, use it because it's a concrete way of showing that this went from a 15th grade level down to an 8th grade level. However, it's tricky to rely on that because the readability tests really focus a lot on length of sentences, how many words, so that's fine, but also multisyllabic words. So the assumption being that if it's a multisyllabic word or words you're using, that's going to raise the grade level. On the other hand, television, for example, might score at a college level because 4 syllables, but ennui, which means boredom, is a 2-syllable word, so that might score at about the 4th grade. And yet people know what the word television means, even I think if they are not familiar with English. So readability is just one part of the picture. The more important is usability. Just as products are tested, hopefully, I assume cars are tested. I know that one. But products are tested to make sure that they're safe, that they're functional, that they can do what the advertisement of the manufacturing company says they can do. Usability means I understand it and I can use it. So it's not just I can read it, but I can understand and use it. So that's why we can't really rely solely on readability tests, because for one thing, they don't really tell us what we like to think they do, but also because the best way to know whether or not something is understandable is to sit and interview, the way we do usability testing, interview members of your customer base and ask them literally to read what has been written, whether it's the original or the revision, and get their responses, because they're testing the understandability of the document the same way they might test a product. So I think
Oh.
that's an easy, I think, way to think about the difference. Something can be readable and not usable, but it can't likely, a document can't likely be usable if people can't understand it. So,
Yeah. So, kind of the writing is the deliverable when we give it to our audience, because they don't see anything else behind the scenes, but they do see that, and that's what they use to either
correct.
carry out instructions. And you said something so interesting in one interview you gave. You said that poorly written documents could result in death and financial ruin. And I'd like to ask you if you could expound upon that for our listeners.
Sure, happy to. Oh, well, I'm not happy about the results of this, but I certainly have things to say. So, for example, I'll give you a couple examples. Number one, so during the mortgage crisis of 2008, when all those houses were foreclosed upon because people signed documents that they didn't understand, research has shown that the lack of that understanding, and not just what was going on in the bank or the lender, but the documents themselves, the lack of understanding contributed to people losing their homes. So as they're signing that mortgage statement, you might have a realtor sitting next to you, but you take that thing home and you have to explain it to someone else, and I doubt anyone could actually do that. But anyway, research shows that the lack of understanding what the mortgage disclosure was saying, telling them, was one of the factors in all those all those foreclosures. So there's the financial side. So the death side, that may be a little hyperbolic. There's a college word for you. What happens if I don't understand the instructions for taking my pills? Or what if I am released from the hospital, but the hospital release form, which they call patient information, is really more of an internal document? And what if, I have to dress a wound at home and the instructions are not clear, and I end up with sepsis or an infection or something else, only because I couldn't understand the medical instructions. So, there are serious and dire consequences to the inability for people to understand content or voting. I could go on about voting materials. So there's another issue, but you wanted death and financial ruin. So there
I
you
wanted
go.
the extreme.
Right. How far can we go with this? Well, we can go to death and financial ruin. I think that's pretty far.
I think that's totally reasonable, though. What you say is logical. It can cause financial ruin. It has
Yes.
historically, and it can cause death. There have been times when my folks have been sent home with hospital instructions and they contradict. I have to call again, or I don't know how to help them, or they could
Exactly.
overdose on medication or not do something right.
Well,
So,
and really,
Exactly.
it can relate to people of all ages. I mean, and not just in medical care, in business. In how many times do I wish I would have really read my first credit card agreement thoroughly and carefully in my 20s, right? And understood all of the documents that come along with that.
Yes.
Now, was
Yes.
some of that just youthful ignorance? Maybe, but some of that was all this legal technical oh, that's okay. I got a credit card. Yay.
Yeah, no, that's a great example because I hear companies say to me, well, people don't read anymore anyway. And I say, that's because we've been trained not to read. So you didn't read that document because it looked like it was going to be really hard for you to understand. You may also, depending on your age, you just may not have cared as well that you're going to pay 24.5% interest. But the information, that's why in the definition we use the word design, because how something looks also draws someone in or pushes someone away. But I always argue that one of the main reasons we don't read so many documents that are so critical to our lives is because they're written in a manner that makes it pretty much impossible for regular people to understand it.
Or it comes across as intimidating. And some businesses
absolutely.
Yeah, and some businesses that may be their goal. But I think the truly smart businesses don't want that, because really, I think truly smart businesses care about their customer and maintaining those customer relations.
There's a funny story about that years ago. I think it was GameStop, maybe was the name of the company, or Game Station. I don't know. I was not a gamer, so I don't remember. But they wrote into their terms of agreement that if you agree, you're giving up your firstborn child. And, like 90 people, because everybody says, I read and agree, and no one, it's the biggest lie in America, right? I have read and I agreed. And I think it's a kind of a squishy territory, because I think lawyers, of course, are responsible for a lot of this complexity. Their job is to mitigate risk for the company. So that means there are going to be situations in which complexity is going to work to their advantage. However, as I mentioned earlier about the contract and the judge voiding it, there have been multiple lawsuits that companies have lost. I've been an expert witness in a few of them, because the content that is being part of the lawsuit was impossible for the intended audience to understand. So the legality of it can go both ways. It can protect the company, but it also could open them up to what I would call, in quotes, harm.
So let me ask you this, and
Sure.
this is confession time, right? Confession is good for the soul. What is something that you still struggle with when it comes to clear communication? I always tell my college students, do as I say, not as I do in some cases. Are there any things that you still catch yourself doing when it comes to writing, playing language, or communication?
Well, most of what I do is really translate from the complex to the simple. So the initial writing part, but I think what you're really asking me is that I need to confess something, like a rule I pay no attention to. So,
or just occasionally that you forget, let's say.
Well, I don't forget. I just know when I'm doing it. So I will. Occasionally I get affect and effect mixed up. I totally ignore the grammatical that we all taught. Don't end a sentence with a preposition. I mean, who cares about that anymore? Truly. I do still care about pronouns, but not the use of they. That's fine with me to use they for anyone who chooses to. But when people say her and I drives me crazy. So, and so I guess even if I let some things slide, I have to confess I know I'm doing it.
I think that's great that you're
right.
I think that's really great that you're willing to own up to it.
Well, I learned years ago being a professor that sometimes the smartest thing you could say to a class of students, or when I do training, is, I don't know the answer to that question. Let's look it up. So
that was the first piece of advice my first mentor gave me before I set foot in a college classroom. Don't be afraid to admit when you don't know, because they will see through you.
Exactly.
So, Deborah, all
Uh,
of this that
yeah,
we've talked about today, let's
yeah.
distill this into your number one rule for clear communication. What
Ooh.
is your number
So,
one rule?
my number one rule is to have a sense of who your audience or audiences are and what they need to know. So the first focus for any piece of writing, if someone sends me something and says, could you convert this to plain language? The first question I ask them is, who is your audience? How do they use this information? What is the purpose? From there, after that, everything else are strategies, but these are more conceptual thinking. So, who is your audience? What is the purpose of the document? What is the context in which they'll read it? So, I think if you don't know the answers to those questions, I think everything else is like it's still important, but you're not going to solve the problems that the complex documents might have created. So, like you said earlier, it's hard to get out of the writer mind to get into the reader mind, but you've got to do that, even if what you're doing is sort of not making it up, but you don't know every customer who reads your content, but you have to have some idea of the purpose of the document and who's going to be reading it.
You've had a number of clients over the years. And as I said, when I introduced you, you've had an amazing career doing lots of different things. But let me ask you, what is the
Sure.
thing that you're most proud of professionally and why?
Uh, in 2017, or 2016, 2017, the League of Women Voters brought, in conjunction with others, brought a lawsuit against the state of New Hampshire because of a new state law that made it more complicated for college students to register to vote. So the Democratic Party, the League of Women Voters, and numerous college students sued in 2017 to block that law. And the law required new voters to fill out complicated forms and expose themselves to possible prosecution and civil fines if they didn't turn over certain proof of resident documents. However, the set of instructions was titled, just for example, about the complexity, was entitled something like verifiable residential situation or something. Verifiable domicile. That was just the title of the document that the college students were supposed to read and understand. And so I was called by the League of Women Voters on their side to be an expert witness in this lawsuit. And my job was to testify on the usability, the readability, understandability of this new law. It was called Senate Bill 3. So when I testified in court, my proudest moment was the judge agreed with the League of Women Voters. Then the next highest level court disagreed with the lawsuit. And then the third level, I think it was the Supreme Court of New Hampshire, vacated the law, which meant that the League of Women Voters won their case. And my testimony was included multiple times in the declaration or pronouncement or whatever. Sorry, I can't think of the legal term. The decision that was made about this. So for me, that to me was like the height and the peak and I don't know, just a moment where you absolutely knew that what I was doing had value beyond just the customers. It had value in terms of democracy.
Wow.
And so I'm so proud of that. I've testified in other lawsuits as well, where understandability was a part of it, but that one was really something for me. So
Wow. Thank you for
yeah,
sharing that.
sure.
That's an incredible story.
Well, yes. I mean, I could have quit doing plain language after that and said, okay, I've done it all. But, this work can go on for decades, and it will. This kind of work will.
Well, with that being said, we always ask our guests 3 very important questions. So
Okay.
let's kind of transition to some of those right now, because then you'll have really achieved the height of everything by having been on our podcast and answered these questions. Okay.
These are the fun questions.
These are the fun questions. All right. What is one thing you wish you had been taught about writing that would have made your professional life easier? Now, what do you wish you would have been taught about writing that would have made your professional life easier?
I would love to have been taught that when you get out of school, the way you were taught to write for school is not quite irrelevant, but not right or correct either. Because when you're in the work world, you are not writing for professors. You are not really going to have to produce a 5-page essay anywhere, or 500 words or whatever. I can't even remember that. So the difference between college or academic writing and work writing is significant. And so I think when I got my doctorate and started teaching tech writing, I hadn't thought about this until just this moment. I was actualizing the one thing I was disappointed about when I was an undergraduate, is that I wasn't really being prepared to write in the world of work.
Wow. That's quite a statement for a professor
Yeah.
to make.
Well, and you both probably went to college. Don't you think that's true? Going into your jobs, and, it's not the same audience. It's not the same context.
You're
You go
absolutely
from
right.
sort of fake writing to real writing that has significant consequences. So
I love that
anyway.
fake writing. So does that mean you're going to write me so I'm in doctoral school right now. You're going to write me a note saying I don't have to finish a paper.
Yeah. No, you
I'd
got to play
appreciate
the game. You got to play the game. You're getting a PhD now? Oh, listen, anytime you can call me and rant. I will, I'll be there to help you.
Thank
Just
you.
do
And
it.
yeah.
Just do it.
It's funny that you mention that college doesn't really prepare you for writing in the world, because we have kind of an ongoing joke where we blame everything on college. It's kind of like anyone that brings in these habits of, well, I have to hit this word count, or I have to sound erudite or something like that. We're like, it's college. It's not you. It's college.
Yes,
It's college.
it is. I can testify on behalf of all students everywhere.
Well, and Elizabeth and I have both made a living at various points teaching at the college level. And so we're right there saying, oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's
There's a
still,
moment
it's
where you
different.
go, there's a moment where you go, oh, I should have taught them that.
And it's like,
Shoot.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Bless their hearts.
Darn.
I live in Charlotte.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, so I hear "bless their hearts" all the time. So I know what it really means.
My family's Southern, so yeah.
Okay. There we go.
Well, let me ask you this. Okay, here's your second big question. What is a writing rule that we hear a lot about but doesn't serve you in your writing life? Now, that's kind of ties in with something we learned in college, but could also tie in with things we've picked up writing habits way back in grade school, some of us.
I think, maybe this is all mixed up in the same, but I think one writing rule we tended to learn was more is better. The more you write about something, the better that is. Well, obviously, plain language would go the other way, like the architect Mies van der Rohe, which is less is more, right?
Mm.
So there's that. As for so I think you need to ask me the question again if you want me to give you a longer answer.
I think that was great. The writing rule that we hear about so much that doesn't necessarily serve us well in our writing. And I
Yeah,
think that was a brilliant answer. Less is
good.
more.
Less is more.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So question number 3, one
Okay.
thing you wish people knew about writing in the business world specifically.
Uh, that to become the kind of writer that business really wants, they have to understand that people need practice with feedback over time. So, in other words, if I were in charge of every business I've ever worked with, every employee would be trained in plain language or clear writing or whatever concept the company thinks is most important. But obviously, for me, it would be plain language. But it's not enough to just tell people rules, because if that's all it took, everybody would be a great writer.
Mm.
But it's practice with feedback over time. Because I use the analogy, just because you can play the piano doesn't mean you can automatically play classical music or automatically play jazz. You can play the piano, you can write, but if you're going to learn to be better at it or do it differently in a way that's more effective for your customers, practice with feedback over time. So I think training is really a critical issue in how to get employees to write and communicate more clearly with each other and with customers.
Mm-hmm. Great advice. Great advice. Thank you.
Deborah, we do one
You're
more
welcome.
segment here in addition to the
Okay.
3. We do the
Okay.
doctor's diagnosis, which is where we have
Huh.
writing ailments that
Okay.
listeners send us, that clients send us, and then we give them a prescription for their writing. This is
What do
our
you?
ailment. It comes from
Okay.
a manager. So this person says,
Okay.
I'm a manager and I'm trying to get my team members to write more clearly, but they're struggling with this. And their writing is still filled with too many complexities and jargon to the point where our clients routinely send things back asking questions
Wow.
because they just don't understand what my team is saying. But my
Right.
team thinks that the complexity in jargon words are necessary to understand the concepts. I don't want to dumb down the documents, but the messages aren't being communicated clearly. What do I do?
Well, notice the use of the term dumb down. And
Mm.
so, again, I'll just go back to what I said earlier, training. They have to be shown examples. So, if not training, give them an example of a document that is common to them and have it rewritten so that it's in plain language or clear, and show them the difference. It's often a show, not a tell. I also advise companies, and I'll advise this manager as well. Make sure that whoever is approving or disapproving their writing understands the same concepts that the manager wants people to write. How he or she wants people to write. It's not enough to just say do better. It's not enough to say this is complicated. I mean, that means nothing, literally. Um, because what is, what do I do? So I think it's about training. It's about showing them examples of what the manager thinks is clear writing, and showing them the way, not telling them what to do.
Great
Mhm.
advice. Tell us how people could get in touch with you and learn more about your work.
Well, you can go. My website is theplainlanguagegroup.com. And my email is Deborah, Deborah, the real way to spell Deborah, at theplainlanguagegroup.com. And I would be more than happy to answer any questions that any of your listeners have, gratis. No charge. Just get in touch with me. Happy to answer questions.
Deborah, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been amazing. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Oh, well,
Thank you,
I
Deborah.
enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you to your audience. And it's so great to talk with other people who are as invested in clear writing as I am.
This is Hurley Writes Writing Docs signing off. May your week be filled with good health and good writing. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Hurley Write can help your employees learn better strategies to be effective and efficient writers. Hurley Write has helped numerous companies solve their writing issues, and we can help your team too. Contact us at 877-249-7483 or email us at info@hurleywrite.com, and one of our writing experts will be in touch.